I'm going to tell you the things that nobody ever told me, and a few of the lies that they did tell me about Aboriginal people. Nobody ever told me by what right my people came to live on this land. Sure, I know the immigration story of my parents from Germany after the war. I even thought I knew the history of Whitecourt where they landed. It had been called Saginawa, where even the rivers come together in some Indian language. Don't ask me which. I felt totally entitled growing up on the land near Whitecourt. That was before I learned about the Treaty 6, which is a land sharing agreement. Nobody ever told me about the responsibilities that came with living on this land. Nobody ever told me about those obligations. I knew very little about the people who had agreed to share their land with me. There was lots of misinformation in books and on television. I knew about the noble Plains chief with the headdress and the bare-chested warriors, but they were long gone. So imagine my surprise as a teen when I found myself in a room full of brown faces. I had thought I knew about my neighbors on Highway 43. My school competed with the other schools in the counties, with the town and farm kids along that road. So I was really surprised when our band teacher brought us into the school in Glen Evis after a music festival in Edmonton. As we set up our band to play music, the kids filed in and sat cross-legged on the floor. It was exactly like in my elementary school whenever we had visitors. No one had ever told me about these neighbors. I was amazed to learn that I grew up in the traditional territory of the Nakota Sioux from Alexis First Nation. I guess everybody knows that now with the Eagle River Casino near Whitecourt that's on Alexis land. But what you might not know is that land given to Alexis near Whitecourt was because the original treaty had been broken. Alexis had been promised a certain amount of reserve land, but they never received the amount that they should have. And some of their land had been illegally expropriated by the government of the day. So that land near Whitecourt was compensation for a past mistake. They never told me other ways that we disrespected our neighbors. For example, I went to church on Sunday morning. But some of the folks from Alexis had to hide their religious practices in the bush near Whitecourt. Why were they done in some obscure location? Because they were scared to go to jail. The Sundance was illegal at the time. Nobody ever told me that in Canada, people were jailed for their religious practices. The turning point for me came when I learned about a historical lie. I had learned about the Frog Lake Massacre in school, and I thought I knew that history. I had learned that it was the savage young warriors who were the instigators. Talk about a stereotype. I later learned about a different story that revolved around the Indian agent. He was a powerful man on the reserve. He had married a local woman, a Cree woman, and one day, when he came home from work, she had a friend visiting her. For some reason, he was angry, and he violently threw this young woman out of his house. She later died of her injuries. During the events at Frog Lake, it was this woman's father who killed the Indian agent. He was not a young man. And though I don't agree with it, I can understand the vengeance of a father who lost his grown daughter. It's an emotion that I understand because it's a common human emotion. My stereotypes about savage warriors were blown apart. It made me wonder about other stereotypes that I have been given. Why are they perpetuated? Why do we continue to see Aboriginal people in these limited ways? My parents are good people, and they wanted to share our stable home life with others. So they took in foster children. Most of these kids were Aboriginal. I made the awful assumption that there was something wrong with Aboriginal parents, that they weren't able to have a good family life. That was because nobody ever told me about residential schools. Nobody ever told me about how parenting skills were decimated when children were abducted to be raised in institutions. We all know about that now, but do you know about the 60s scoop? Well-meaning, well-intentioned white social workers, probably folks not unlike my parents and myself, deemed the care given Aboriginal kids in their homes inadequate, and they were scooped up in the 60s and put into protective custody. Sometimes it was a case of not understanding the different ways of doing things in close-knit communities and extended families. It was maybe a bit of a case of stereotypes continued. The media tells me that Aboriginal leaders are corrupt. I know a chief who has a master's degree and earns $42,000 a year. I've heard her speak in her community, telling them about what she's doing. She tells them about decisions in Ottawa and how they affect people at home. I've seen her give away dry meat to elders at a public event. Was that buying votes? Or was that expressing her cultural values of sharing and respecting elders? I have heard the registrar of a reserve-based First Nations college defend herself against allegations of corruption. Sure, she says, half of the students that she admits to the college are her relatives. But then again, half the reserve are her relatives as well. It's only proportional. You don't have to look on First Nations to find stories of corruption in the news today. I made another erroneous assumption, that Aboriginal people aren't very smart. I didn't know any teachers or doctors that were Aboriginal growing up. That was because nobody ever told me that if an Indian got an education, he could be forcibly enfranchised. That means that he would no longer be considered an Indian and could no longer live with his family on the reserve. A friend told me about her uncles who all quit school in grade 9 because of this rule. I later met one of her uncles and found an intelligent man who wisely protected his connection to the people he loved. Let me tell you about another blatant lie. Indians are lazy. I can't even tell you where I heard that, but I knew it growing up. Everyone knew it. I had a playhouse in my backyard, and nobody ever told me that the trees that were felled, sawed, and planed to build that playhouse were built with Aboriginal labor. I knew 2 single parents who worked 2 jobs so that their kids could participate in sports. They were always on the go, working days, working evenings, traveling with the team. They were hard-working Aboriginal people. When I started to meet the folks from Alexis, they told me how they cleared the right-of-way for Highway 43 and Highway 16. How many of our forests can we now enjoy because Aboriginal wildland firefighters protected that valuable resource? Aboriginal people are not lazy, at least no more or less than any other people. Never once, when people started telling me these things, was I made to feel guilty. Just like I do not feel guilty for the Holocaust, despite the fact that my father was a soldier at 18 in Hitler's army. We must learn from past mistakes and not repeat them. The perspectives and policies towards Aboriginal people are clearly past mistakes. We need to do something different, something that isn't based on misinformation and stereotypes. I was brought out of my ignorance with incredible kindness, with a sincere desire to build new relationships, build on new understanding. My stereotypes were blown apart. I started to see the diversity in the Aboriginal community. I started to see our common humanity, our shared history, our shared land. After all, we're neighbors. And when they told me these things, they asked me to tell you, to help you explode your stereotypes, to help you realize that to enter into a new relationship with our neighbors, we need to keep an open mind. We need to get rid of our stereotypes and assumptions. We need to ask ourselves, what are the things that nobody ever told you, and a few of the lies that they did about Aboriginal people?